Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Bowman, Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Brain, and I want to welcome you to this presentation on managing compliance factors in supply chain, a maturity model approach, episode 4 in a series presented by Deloitte. One quick reminder before we get going, there will be an audience question and answer session at the end of this presentation. Audience members are encouraged to submit their questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So, regulatory compliance is a fact of life for most, if not all, supply chains. So it's absolutely essential that organizations understand the complex regulatory environment and build compliance into their end-to-end supply chains. So today, we're going to learn how to do that with a particular focus on the advantages of using technology to achieve that crucial goal. With that, I want to introduce our speakers for today. Daniel C. Dethloff is a manager with Deloitte Consulting LLP. Daniel has more than 19 years of professional experience across the public and private sectors in the U.S. and Southeast Asia. He applies leading practices such as the digital capabilities model for supply chain networks, as well as process improvement methodologies such as Lean Six Sigma and business process reengineering to reduce cost and enhance performance for diverse industries and products. Michael Windai is manager with Deloitte Consulting LLP. Michael has 20 years of experience in public and commercial logistics management and leadership in both the U.S. and Australia. He is a subject matter expert in warehouse operations, transportation, and enterprise strategy for both domestic and international network optimization. Michael is a certified Six Sigma Black Belt with knowledge and training in DMAIC, DMEDI, and Lean Six Sigma. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dan Dethloff. Dan, take it away.
Thanks, Bob. So, as Bob mentioned, the need for regulatory compliance is an imperative of all who operate a supply chain. And why does that matter so much? Simply put, it comes down to the consequences of compliance failures. They can be quite severe for not only your own enterprises, your own organizations, but also for other stakeholders across the supply chain that you are part of. At a high level, you can lose customers. You might face government sanctions. Of course, as a result of both of those, you may lose profits. You may have environmental destruction that you unleash. You could face bankruptcy. And ultimately, depending on the kind of supply chain you operate, it could lead to loss of life. And so with that in mind, managing the compliance within your supply chain is not just a business imperative, but it can be a moral imperative for your organization. So what kinds of compliance elements ought a business or another organization be concerned with? Bob mentioned regulatory regimes as kind of a key cornerstone, but as supply chain is integral to nearly every part of an organization, it's quite cross-cutting. And as I speak about it, consider also not just legal and regulatory compliance, but also your contractual obligations and even the internal policies that impact the execution of your supply chain, whether they pertain to product safety or social responsibility and supply integrity, including ethical sourcing, or trade, import, and export controls, such as ITAR. Before I talk to the maturity model, one of the key things that I've seen as a nuanced issue with a number of clients is right sizing the way that they approach their supply chain compliance regime and related internal controls. Too little compliance makes you vulnerable, of course. On the other hand, I've had clients which have what I call the hedge problem. If you think about a compliance failure as maybe like falling off a cliff, you may want to protect against compliance failure by having somebody manually watching out for risks and issues around supply chain and compliance regulations. Maybe you want to go a step beyond that, put up the equivalent of a fence. You have internal controls in place that'll prevent your supply chain personnel from doing something that will lead to your organization falling off that cliff. Many organizations that I've worked with have then gone a step further and they put up a hedge to continue the analogy, a hedge in front of that fence to keep them from that much further away. And then in some cases, they put up a further hedge and a further hedge. And at that point, they begin to lose the flexibility that they need for their supply chain to operate with anything resembling efficiency. So it's very important as we consider how you implement controls and technologies which enable your supply chain to meet regulatory, contractual, and other compliance obligations, that you right-size things. We've had, as an example, a government client that does a wall-to-wall inspection every year, and they're doing 100%, making sure they're doing that 100% inspection each and every year, and they fail each and every year. On the other hand, we've had other clients who have similar requirements to make sure they're inspecting and verifying their inventory, and they use random, statistically driven checks, they've got better results with less operating requirements, reduced drag on the way that they act in their supply chain. So now that I've laid out that caution to consider, when I speak to the maturity model, combining our experience, Mike's, my own, as well as that of many of our Deloitte colleagues, we've identified a maturity model that we believe reflects the approaches used by a majority of organizations in managing their supply chain compliance. At the low end of the spectrum, we have the ad hoc manual approach, and it's we'll talk more about each of these as we go. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we've got approaches that, as Bob previewed, take into account how technology can be used to not only ensure that your own organization is in compliance with supply chain regulations and contractual obligations, but also that your suppliers and that you're helping your customers to be in compliance as well. One further thing to note that I've observed with many clients is, in many cases, they may see their organization as operating in the performing or leading levels without realizing that there may be significant pockets of variation occurring where they may have parts of their organization or other parts of their supply chains operating at that lower level and putting the entire supply chain at risk. We'll continue on. So, at the most basic level, I've seen and I've experienced, I've actually run the compliance regime for a small business. When I started my career, I worked in the wine business that was operating at that ad hoc or manual level. There was really no formal compliance regime in place. Everything was done retrospectively. A lot of it was done manually. We didn't have training. I got to know Julie, I still remember her first name, at the State Liquor Control Board well enough that I think when I called her with questions, she recognized my voice. And the challenge with being at level one is your organization is itself at risk. I still remember it very well, I had the Alcohol and Trade Bureau come to do an inspection. And I have to say it was coincidental that the owners of the business were not available that day. All of the sales personnel were very busy with their sales calls, and so was everybody else out of the building, leaving me to deal with a couple of very unhappy TTB agents pouring through my manual chicken scratch paperwork. And we did survive that, but it was a wake-up call. Years later, we found that the business did have, in addition to the challenge, being at this ad hoc level opens you up for other issues such as fraud and theft. And we found that we had an employee who was, taking inventory. I also was involved years ago with a client who had a food security related supply chain. And they had many issues. They were running a lot of their supply chain in the same manner. And we found at the local level that there was some redistribution of those in-kind benefits. So being in the manual level is not where I would recommend being. As we continue to go to level two, this is typically characterized by Compliance being what I would say is inconsistent. There may be internal controls. You may have your supply chain processes documented, but a lot of the times what I've seen is both in organizations I've worked for and with clients is that their approach to making sure that they have complied with regulation or complied with their own internal controls and policies is through inspection or even using 100% inspection to pave over gaps and challenges and then enforcing things in a heavy-handed post hoc manner. There are often avenues, of course, for employee reporting, but they're not necessarily marketed. And I've seen a number of challenges with organizations that I would say live at level 2. As I mentioned previously, my first job out of school was in the wine business. We had a customer who their internal review processes for all of our invoices and then to cut us a check were so sufficiently burdensome because of the multiple levels that they ended up going out of business because it cost them more to go through the administrative act of paying their suppliers than the profit that they gained from many of the purchases that they made and then resold as a retailer. I've also seen examples where organizations think that they have robust internal controls only to discover that they don't. For example, I had a client who had a system in place that was monitoring their inventory, but surprisingly, they had a shared login for many of their users. And the avenues that they had for reporting these challenges just weren't insufficient for them to be surfaced before we were brought in to take a look at what was happening. At level 3, this is what I used to consider, what I think many consider the gold standard. Historically, it was the gold standard. Compliance with regulation is built into processes. By executing the process according to documented processes, you're adhering to your contractual obligations, legal and regulatory obligations, and internal policy. Governance is in place. Leadership emphasizes compliance. There are typically in these organizations compliance professionals who oversee programs and who work with the professionals throughout the organization to ensure that those documented standards and policies are kept up to date as regulations change, as contracts change, and obligations change. Inspection here is typically statistically driven, and it's done through random sampling. There's training on compliance. It's regularly emphasized. Typically, there's a testing and monitoring function to advise if there are risks, and there's early warnings if there are opportunities for ethical breakdown and if there are problems with the internal controls. One of my formative experiences in my career was working at a place that really excelled at this level, and they sought to engage everybody from the folks who work on the manufacturing floor through leadership in ensuring and being able to advise when they saw an issue with compliance to regulation and internal policy. The challenge that we have, and I've seen increasingly, is as supply chains are more disaggregate and are less closely held and less closely managed, this isn't no longer sufficient. Which brings me to what I classify as level 4. Here, those capabilities are extended beyond the enterprise. Compliance is woven into not only the cultural fabric of the organization, but it's also woven into how everyone within that organization interacts with suppliers and even with customers. Typically, there's a holistic third-party compliance program in place to manage the life cycle of any third-party relationships, including integrated screening, so that you take into account how the other organizations with which you work and whether or not they have insufficient compliance regimes may put you and your own supply chains at risk. Additionally, technology solutions such as supply chain control towers, also called supply chain command centers, are used to enable compliance and both the procedures and also the sharing of critical data and documents across enterprises. And beyond that, in an ideal world, you have automated checks in place to validate procedures, validate paperwork is in place when it needs to be to comply with regulations. I'm going to take a little aside on supply chain control process. One of the things that Bob shared with us is that we have a variety of experience among the members of our audiences. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Some of you, this may be the first time you've heard the term or had it described in any detail. So let me take a brief interlude to talk about what a supply chain control tower is and the term. So I could probably do an entire separate presentation on supply chain control towers, maybe next year's series in 2025. But very briefly to describe what it is, at its most basic, a supply chain control tower is a technology solution and the related ways of working that enable an organization to manage by exception, and that includes managing their compliance by exception, as well as to manage across the extended enterprise, including with their suppliers, and to share with their customers. It's a way of working. It's typically supported by a insights and decision support platform workflow typically. And typically there's an organization within an organization of supply chain subject matter experts with the deep knowledge of supply chain and of analytics and the business issues to enable them to monitor, manage, and improve supply chain processes. It is not a physical room like a mission control. I've described it a little bit like that by analogy to some before, but it isn't mission control like NASA mission control or SpaceX mission control, maybe as we're talking about in a modern way. It's not a bunch of just dashboards or something that's very specific to a single supply chain process area like a transportation management system, but it really is an extended capability far beyond that, that enables end-to-end orchestration. Again, in this case, we're talking about with respect to compliance, but in general, if your organization struggles with coordination and collaboration, and you have a heavy reliance on external partners, as well as lack of visibility into those partners, then a supply chain control tower may be a very useful solution to consider. Now I'm going to hand it over to Mike. I'm just going to talk a little bit about how technologies and tools such as supply chain control towers, while they present opportunities to really help you with your management of compliance regimes for your supply chain, also those same technologies that you use in your day-to-day business or mission may actually represent a risk of introducing new challenges. Mike?
All right, thank you, Dan. As Dan and Bob mentioned, I'm got some background in warehousing and Six Sigma and getting more into smart operations. So introducing technology to warehouse operations, manufacturing, and that sort of thing. So inventory accuracy has become a solid focus the last few years, and increasing inventory accuracy can be done with the benefit of tools and technologies. However, those same tools and technologies can actually be a bit of a double-edged sword as they bring compliance issues along with them. So the hardware, the networks, where the data resides, how the data is transferred, all become potential risks for compliance. So the government has regulations around hardware and software, ranging from, say, TAA, which is Trade Agreements Act, all the way up to FedRAMP and full ATO, authority to operate. So those rigorous processes involve time, a lot of time, testing, money, to make sure every bit of the hardware and software is tested, so that you can bring it onto a government site where classified data may reside. Next. Okay, so we've got the hardware and the software, but what about the companies that are supplying this hardware and software? So the government is constantly monitoring foreign companies for legal compliance and issues a list of prohibited entities. So any organization acting as a contractor for any federal agency must comply with this prohibition in order to receive the funding from the federal government. If we can go to the next slide, we can talk about how Deloitte has intellectual property that helps to open up the supply chain sub-tiers of your potential client. So we can all remember the supply chain issues facing the world a few years ago. So in a post-COVID environment, there's continued focus on the supply chain resiliency, and we're seeing an increased demand across all industries and sectors for greater transparency in their supply chains. And we, like many firms, have a capability that provides this. So we actually have IP that can actually look into the sub-tiers of your suppliers to ensure that they are compliant with the rules and the regulations established and are not suspect or banned suppliers or excluded countries from your supply chain. So in the next slide, I'll show you an actual supply chain bloom that we ran with a client that showcases a United States supplier that's represented domestically in blue, but then all of the sub-tiers and they go down by size. So the green and the yellow are their direct sub-tiers, and then the smaller dots represent those sub-tiers. So there are over 80 domestic suppliers, but there were over 500 foreign suppliers. And you can see for this particular example, Made in USA and maintaining TAA compliance was a priority. But you could see, for example, Made in China is vastly apparent in the supply chain bloom. So we were able to actually avoid this client through our IP because of the rigorous compliance that the IP was able to provide. Now I'll toss it back to Dan for wrap up.
Dan, you're muted.
Thanks, Bob.
Sure.
Nice, Mike. So at this point, I'll turn to a subject that this feels kind of obligatory to touch upon with respect to nearly everything. And in terms of supply chain and compliance, AI is, like other technologies mentioned, a tool that can be very useful in managing your supply chain's compliance. I can't begin to give full coverage of AI in general, or even generative AI, but in this particular case, one of the ways that you can apply large language models, such as ChatGPT or Bard, is to use their capabilities in intelligent search, intelligent summarization, and the generation of new content to help distill and understand the regulations and the policies that you have to comply with as you plan and alter and update and improve over time your supply chains and your supply chain processes. For example, Deloitte has created a tool to help one of our clients to summarize complex federal regulations that they have to comply with and help them to understand and explain it to new personnel that are joining that entity and that organization. And critically, as I think we all have heard about let's call it concerns or challenges around the use of AI, and I think the correct term of art is hallucination, the possibility that you'll receive input and feedback from a generative AI that is not necessarily correct or maybe essentially made up. In our example, we use a the tool provides citations to the original sources so that a human being can go in, read the summary that has been generated through the tool set, verify or confirm that it does make sense given the sources cited, but not have to generate it completely from scratch. Other ways that AI can be used in a similar fashion are in the same manner for SOP or standard operating procedure management, providing summaries and syntheses of your standard operating procedures to increase and improve training, again, with the goal of enabling you to train your personnel and ensure that they are complying with processes that ultimately have you complying with regulations, contractual obligations, and internal policies. Further shift, I want to come back to the model for a moment. When I opened up talking about the maturity model, I talked about 4 levels in the model. We've gone through this over the course of this conversation, and I want to take a moment and actually ask you to think further about completely shifting the way you approach complying with regulation. And rather than thinking of regulations, contractual obligations as a burden, think about it as an opportunity. Touched on a couple times the fact that I started my career in the wine business. I currently serve in Deloitte's government and public services practice. In both cases, my job exists in part because there are compliance regimes that each company has to adhere to in their supply chains. The wine importer in Washington state really only existed because of regulations that enforced a 3-tier system in that state that required retailers and restaurants to not go directly to wineries outside of the state, but to obtain their wines through distributors. And while there were distributors of other beverages, such as sodas, in the state, not all of them wanted to comply with all of the complex requirements of distribution of alcoholic beverages in the state, which provided a market opportunity for that company. So regulatory regimes can create not just burdens, but white space or opportunities where you can distinguish yourself against your competitors in being more efficient in adhering or adhering to things that others may not be willing to adhere to. So compliance is in fact an opportunity. So before I turn it back over to Bob for the panel questions, just to kind of conclude and close, I opened up introducing the imperative of compliance regimes, and at the end of the day, failure to comply with regulations and comply with contractual obligations or even internal policies can pose really, and it's capital for a reason, an existential risk to your supply chain. It can lead to the end of an organization, the inability to carry out a mission if it's a nonprofit or governmental organization. And given that, it just is unimperative. Ultimately, today, there's a lot of technology that can really support your ability to comply without it being quite so burdensome, and to work to coordinate across the entirety of your supply chain to do so. And then finally, as I just touched upon, compliance regimes are actually an opportunity in disguise in my experience across my career. And it's important that you not only consider the opportunity as they exist today, but I'd encourage you to actively monitor for regulatory changes as a critical tactic, as a habit, either whether you're a commercial or public sector organization. Supply chain professionals should be monitoring because failures can be costly, but also new regulation can bring about opportunity. So thank you all. Bob, I turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Dan. And let me bring in Mike as well at this point for the panel discussion portion of our presentation. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much, Dan. And hello, Mike. Dan, I want to start out with a question just to ask you to elaborate a little more on this idea of how compliance regimes can provide an opportunity. You alluded to the wine industry as being a great example of that, about the type of regulatory structure that companies can set up. Indeed, wouldn't even have if it were not for these regimes. But how can you give me other examples of like how compliance positions you competitively in an industry?
So let me take, for example, in the current political landscape in the U.S., there is an increase in this administration of, I hesitate to use the words because I think it's kind of considered by economists kind of a bad phrase, but industrial policy style regulations such as the Chips and Sciences Act, and there's funding designated from that to improve R&D, manufacturing, and education around the semiconductor industry. But there are provisions in that which require you to comply and report with whom else you engage in any joint research, and there are clawback provisions. If you are able to do the work, to do the proper vetting of the third parties you bring into those opportunities, you're far better positioned to seek opportunities aligned to the Chips and Sciences Act, or other opportunities opened up by this new industrial policy style regulation that's coming in. And even if you're not specialized in semiconductors, there can be opportunities to be part of the outsourced services that serve that industry if you're able to comply with the regulations and legislation that will flow down to you from the primary experts and organizations playing in that domain.
Thank you. Well, there's a long history of companies benefiting from regulation. I almost hate to say it, in terms of things that require better visibility of operations. Well, who doesn't want better visibility of operations? And if you're forced to do it, fine, whatever it took, you're in better shape because you had to comply. Thanks for making that point. Mike, you presented on this concept of supplier illumination, which is a term I really like. Are there uses that beyond compliance concerns for that particular capability?
Yes. I guess at the core of it all, it's all about risk. So beyond compliance, your supply chain could involve companies that have financial distress, reputational risk to you, unreported supplier recalls, and these risks could be several tiers down in the supply chain. So the supplier illumination bloom actually helps you to gain visibility of those supply chain risks, and they obviously overlap with compliance, but it is beyond just compliance.
That was a great visual representation of what a supply chain actually looks like, not just a series of linear links, but man, that a bloom is a great word for that. Thank you so much for bringing that to us. Dan, you were talking about monitoring changes in compliance requirements. I'm especially interested that you introduced AI as an engine for the store of knowledge about regulations, but the AI is only as good as your ability to input updates in those requirements. Is there a person doing it? Is the AI itself smart enough to scrape the world and discover these things for itself? What are your recommendations on how to monitor for changes in compliance requirements and enter that into your system?
Yeah, so, when I spoke about level 3, I mentioned that when you're at that sort of historic gold standard, compliance is itself a career path within many of these organizations. And so it's incumbent upon those individuals to make that regular monitoring, not only internally, but externally of that landscape, a part of their daily routine or weekly routine, and as appropriate, depending on the industry. I realize that not every business or organization that folks on this call are part of has the scale to make that happen as someone's sole job. But even in a small business where you have people wearing a lot of different hats, again, like I started my career in, it's important that someone, and I would actually recommend maybe two people better than one, based on my own experience, is assigned and wears that compliance hat, and it becomes part of their daily responsibility to work through that. Whoever that is should be, monitoring what's coming from their regulators that are applicable to their industry. They should be even just paying attention to the basics in the news. Sometimes I found things that I found were coming down the pike, legislation that was being discussed at the state or federal level that was going to have an impact on a client. And I know that sounds simple, but it's critical. And I've been surprised how many times just the basic act of keeping up with the news has led me to a realization that I've got to start moving out and prepping for a change in the compliance regime that we're subject to, or my client is subject to.
Mhm.
In terms of that AI possibility, in our case, in the example that I gave, we're pulling from essentially a data source that is being otherwise updated. And so it's the way that, as I understand it, and I'm not heavily involved, if I'm frank, but as I understand it, it regularly sort of recrawls and refreshes the data. It's the AI's search of that data source is recrawled and refreshed on some regularized basis. In the same way that human person, when you don't have an AI, has to recheck and refresh on a regular basis.
Yeah. Well, there have always been or long been databases on regulations as they evolve around the world, but it sounds like this is putting it on steroids in effect with the AI capability, plus your advice to pay special attention to it, not just throw it over the wall to legal and say, well, if something changes, they'll let us know. Don't trust that, right? I hear you say.
Yeah.
Dan, also want to ask you, I know from your background, of course, that you worked in multiple countries. How does all this look different when you're operating in or you're working with certain resource constrained environments, such as lower and middle income countries?
Sure. So I think, one of the key things that I surface, not just when it comes to compliance, but all things around supply chain interactions in those types of environments, is it's really important not to view them or treat them as monolithic, but to understand, just as I've said, that you can have differences in the maturity level within a given organization, you can have differences in the supply chain maturity level of compliance with respect to compliance and with everything else in different parts of a given area, given country. It's high variability, and not always sufficient, but a good starting way to start segmenting is to look at cities versus the suburban versus the rural or peri-urban areas. In the city, you can apply the more sophisticated technologies such as AI, the kinds of monitoring sensors, because you've got the infrastructure there. Same is true in the suburban areas and these resource constrained areas. You have to look at what level of resource constraint you have and not make assumptions, and take as much advantage as you can to put in place the most mature capability you can in order to ensure compliance. Because in many of the supply chains that I've interacted with in these kinds of environments, it's not just there isn't just a business imperative, but as I mentioned, there's often a moral imperative at play. And so that becomes something to keep in mind. Another thing that's really important to bear in mind is, if you're an American, a U.S. citizen operating, that there is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to keep in mind. And I'm not a lawyer, this isn't legal advice. I recommend familiarizing yourself directly. But it is unlawful for a U.S. person to engage in any kind of bribes, provision of bribes, in these environments, and such as something to be wary of as a specific supply chain compliance
Yeah.
element to take into consideration.
I'm also wondering, maybe, Mike, you could help me out with this. I mean, if you were to ask whose responsibility in the organization is it for compliance, of course, the answer would be everybody's. Everyone's responsible for compliance. And yet, even that being the case, who typically should should be the individual who is overseeing a compliance effort? Is there a general title, Chief Compliance Officer, COO, CSCO, or is the label less important than the fact that you actually have somebody? Mike, what do you think about that?
What I've typically seen within clients is their IT department goes all the way up to a lead. It's called the ISM, Information Security, Safety and Security Manager, I believe it's called, for one of my clients. And believe it or not, there are actually risks to the hardware and software that they bring on site, to the point where if something is breached, that person could face jail time. So there are some serious consequences to supply chain risk and bringing in hardware and software that is unauthorized, because there are severe consequences to that person, not only losing their job, but potentially facing prison time for exposing this particular client to the risks.
So an IT expert in that case.
Yes.
Somebody overseeing IT.
100%.
Interesting. Yeah. At this point, I'd like to bring the audience into the portion of our presentation involving audience Q&A. And even as we are answering these questions that have already come in, audience members are encouraged to continue to submit their questions as we go. We'll get to as many of them as we can. So Dan, I have a question here, which I think I'm going to clearly direct it to you. They said, Dan, spent some time talking about the importance of sharing compliance data and documents with customers and getting it from my suppliers. Why do I need a control tower, Dan, instead of just using email?
Sure. So, like illumination, there are advantages beyond compliance. And I'll talk to those first and then come back to how it helps you with compliance. First of all, you have, again, as supply chains are becoming more disaggregate and you have more stakeholders that you're working with, you have an increasing number of connections you need to make, whether that is with direct EDI or API, or whether that's by email, in order to orchestrate across your supply chain. And so something like a supply chain control tower has the advantage of reducing the number of communications that you have to make. Many of us have probably seen that drawing of, if you have two stakeholders, you've got one connection for communication. If you've got three stakeholders, now you need three. But as soon as you get to four, it starts to explode. It's got a geometric relationship. So something like a control tower enables you to reduce that and have essentially a single rail or a single source of truth for sharing and integration of your data that may be needed for reporting, or your compliance documents that may be needed for something like customs or other cross-border requirements. It also reduces the effort to bring people on and off because they've got, again, that single rail. You're only creating that single connection. We've got a client for whom we're putting a control tower in place, and we're giving them workflows and validations so that when, back to the customs example, if customs documents aren't where they are supposed to be uploaded to the system for use in anticipation of a shipment arriving to port, then it can send alerts when something is supposed to be there isn't, so that they can move into action with enough time to not end up incurring demurrage for a period of time while they are then trying to get that paperwork all set up. It also enables better organization and archiving of data, and enables reporting and dashboards. Specifically when it comes to comparing it to email, having a system like a control tower enables the history to live on beyond that longevity of that single employee who, you may lose their emails, you may lose an important document that you need if they leave the organization. and their emails are consigned to the dustbin.
Interesting. Yeah. It's interesting also that control towers up to this point have been sold to us as largely a mechanism just for overall visibility and status of things in transit. And now you're offering the control tower as a solution to compliance in addition to that. It seems like a natural transition, but I hadn't heard that much talk about it used being for that purpose. So I really appreciate you bringing that to the table.
Yep.
Thank you very much for that. Mike, hardware can be a double-edged sword for compliance, but you also advocated the use of AI tools. We talked about AI tools for compliance. However, this questioner is saying, isn't AI also a potential problem?
It is. So when you think about AI, it is handling data, right? And utilizing information. So if you have proprietary data within your own company or within your supply chain, that could potentially be exposed as well. So the controls that you have around your data and around your supply chain could be exposed. So you need to be extra cautious, and through the testing of that compliance, AI and machine learning could expose you to additional risk. So the additional testing and approvals need to be made on both the hardware and the software, as you mentioned.
Thanks. I'll direct this one to Dan. Dan, this questioner says, I work in the public sector, and you both come from the government and public services practice of Deloitte. Yet a lot of the presentations seem focused on private sector supply chains. How is this applicable for governments?
So, the first thing I'd say is it's just as important as it is for the commercial sector that regulation be taken into account. I mean, in some ways, it's maybe even more consequential, because if you think about the scale of government, the number of lives that may be touched by various supply chains, everything from the defense supply chains to an aid supply chain, food aid. I mentioned I work in the food security supply chain. That was a government supply chain. There are supply chains that provide medicines and critical support in disaster response. And any compliance failures that lead those supply chains to be less agile, less effective, can touch, even unfortunately lead to severe negative impacts to a large number of lives. More sort of tactically for personnel involved, Mike mentioned that in making the wrong procurement decisions for governments around technology, you can end up with one of the personnel actually going to jail. And that's true for, at least in the federal government of the US, you have contracting officers, and they have many regulations that they have to comply with. And not only do they, does failure to comply put budgets at risk, does it put them at the chance of having to answer to Congress, or but job loss and even jail can be a consequence. But ultimately, for government supply chains, a lot of the time it's not a loss of profit that's the concern. It's a failure of a mission, and those missions can be critical and life-changing for the constituencies that those supply chains are intended to serve.
Question for Mike, I guess. Have you come across any examples where sub-tier suppliers proved to be a problem after running the supply chain illumination and examining the bloom?
Yes, we did have a client that required made in USA, if possible, minimum TAA, Trade Agreements Act. And one of the pieces of hardware that we were procuring for this client, it turned out via the supply chain bloom that we ran, was actually being white labeled from a company in China. So it was a made in USA company, but it was actually a Chinese product. When we approached the vendor upon this, they asked how we found out. It wasn't a very positive conversation, but we shared that with the client, and we were successfully able to avoid that risk of a made in China piece of hardware, bringing that onto the client site. It was so successful. The client actually hired our company to do more supply chain blooms for them. So it was a very successful illumination.
Thanks, Mike. We're getting really close to being out of time, but let me just squeeze this one in from the audience. Dan, you've described a lot of what you're talking about. It seems to be aimed at larger organizations, higher levels of maturity. What would you say to someone who is in small business?
Yeah, so we touched on this before about, making sure it's specifically assigned to at least one, preferably a couple of people as part of their job roles, that compliance is owned by somebody. It's not just assumed that everybody will be part of making sure that the organization complies with regulations and policy and procedure. It's just as important that time is assigned for it. Maybe it's finding a slower time of year if such a thing exists. Again, I'll pull in the wine business because that was my formative small business experience. We would set aside the day after Thanksgiving. We made all our deliveries and pushed for Black Friday, the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday before Thanksgiving. When Black Friday came around, all of our customers wanted to be serving their customers. They didn't want us to be coming through the door, so they typically had pre-stock. And we would use and set aside that day as a day where not only would myself, as the guy that had the compliance hat as my main hat, but everybody would be part of going through our documentation, going through our warehouse and inventory, validating, verifying that everything was in a row.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I mentioned as well, we had this issue where we had leakage, we had theft. And I think it's important for small businesses to, you can start to feel, in large businesses, you trust people, you want to trust people, but it's important to trust and verify. I'm still in touch with some other folks from that time, and was talking about it with somebody who mentioned
Dan, I'm so sorry that I got to get you to wrap up with the answer to that question because we are just about out of time. I really apologize to our audience because it's interesting, but I do want to get to what we have as the two final questions here. And I have one for each of you. And let me give this first one to Dan. So Dan, on the maturity model itself, there's a warning about quote unquote getting stuck at level 3. Can you speak a bit more as to why that's an issue and where you've seen it?
Sure. So, when I spoke about it, I talked about level 3, and I've said this a few times, it was a historic gold standard. And the danger of getting stuck there is organizations that, I guess, sort of rest on their laurels. And they think that they've got it all sorted out, not recognizing, again, this concern about potential variability in pockets of internal controls weaknesses within their own organization, or as importantly, with their suppliers. I suppose the last several years of supply chain disruptions post-COVID, even the recent unfortunate tragedy in Baltimore, have reduced the likelihood that organizations take supply chain for granted, take supply chain risk for granted. But from a compliance perspective, it's really important to be aware of, how your suppliers may place you at risk, and how pockets of failures in compliance may place your organization at risk. And technology can help you with both of those, both the internal and external monitoring of adherence to supply chain regulatory, contractual, and other compliance regimes.
Thanks, Dan. Mike, your final question. You touched on the use of hardware in supply chain compliance as well as the risk that it provides. Can you speak to another use case for how hardware can assist with compliance? And on the flip side, given the increased risk of cybersecurity as technology advances, are there tools that can actually help with security?
There are. So my background being in warehousing, we were able to implement biotech cameras that were able to identify facial recognition of authorized versus unauthorized. And you can utilize this smart technology to actually place these security cameras in higher security areas so that you can have a warning sent directly to on-site security or a supervisor saying, hey, you've got a person that's in this area that does not belong. And those warnings help the client to heighten and tighten their security, I should say, around their operations. So, Deloitte, not only the supply chain bloom, but the cybersecurity experts were able to actually help ensure that the technology that we bring on site is heightening their supply chain compliance and doesn't actually put the clients at risk.
Thank you so much to both of you, Dan and Mike, for a great presentation. This is an imperative, as both of you point out. Your very survival as an organization can depend on your following the advice that you heard today in this hour. So I want to thank you guys and thank the audience also for your great questions as well. I do want to draw your attention to staying tuned for the next episode in this particular Deloitte series of webinars. This one is on generative AI and digital twin. Look for it coming in May of 2024. So once again, everybody, thanks very much, Dan and Mike and audience and everybody. Have a great day.